After a lot of back and forth, the party waved through the fund in exchange for more money for social housing.
Pressure has worked. $3 billion in the middle of a housing and rental crisis going on public and community housing will make a difference. It got us to the point where we're prepared to pass the legislation, having secured that extra $3 billion, and now the fight turns to renters.
It is the biggest boost to social housing in years.
Well, it's a significant shift in the right direction, and that is recognising that we need government funding to deliver housing for people with very high needs and very low incomes. And that seems to have been a recognition that governments have forgotten over the decades. So we've got a shift in direction, but the scale is nowhere near proportionate to the need.
Nicole Gurran is a professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Sydney.
The research evidence shows that we need around 450,000 social and affordable homes right now to meet our existing need. Another figure that might help us understand whether it's anywhere enough might be the social housing waiting list, which nationally is around 150,000 households.
And so how did we end up with such a shortfall in social housing? Is it simply the fact that successive governments haven't prioritised this enough?
If we look back to the mid-80s, for instance, around 10 to, in some years, 12.5% of all new homes that were being produced in Australia were being supported in some way by the public sector. Now, we discovered, that word neoliberalism in the 90s and the 2000s, and this sort of belief that's been proven absolutely nowhere, that the market itself, if governments could get out of the way, might be able to solve problems like housing. Now, in a funny way, actually, governments didn't get out of the housing market at all. We, in fact, shifted our support to the demand side. So incentivising, for instance, landlords to get into property investment through negative gearing, and providing a very modest, actually, income subsidy to renters in the private sector, now called Commonwealth Rent Assistance. The bill for that is rising.
Who are we talking about here? Who will benefit from the Housing Future Fund? What sort of Australians are currently on those social housing waiting lists?
If we think about a continuum of housing need from people on very, very low incomes, so they might be on the pension, they might be receiving unemployment benefits, they're households with very low incomes, there will always need to be some form of government support to help them access, appropriate, decent housing. They will be eligible for social housing. We move up the continuum just a little bit and we'll have low-income workers who now, in comparison to even 30 years ago, low-income workers might be working full-time. They are no longer able to afford decent rental housing almost anywhere in Australia, and certainly nowhere within striking distance of their work. So when we talk about affordable rental housing, that's the cohort through to moderate income workers, people with university degrees, people that we absolutely depend on, our police, our nurses, our teachers. At this point, the scale of the fund is too small to have a noticeable impact on the demand for affordable rents across the private rental sector.
Do you think that we can rely on the market to solve the housing crisis on its own?
Look, the evidence over the past 30 years in Australia, but not only Australia, we're certainly not the only country that's facing, a crippling affordability crisis. And the evidence is that the market doesn't provide affordable and secure housing for people on low and increasingly moderate incomes. It's not enough. That's why governments have always stepped in to intervene to underwrite the funding that we need to provide decent housing, and also to provide income support for people trying to access rental housing in the private sector.
The Greens used the passage of this fund to call on the Albanese government to work with the states for a freeze or a cap or a restriction in rents. Instead, the government's focus seems to be firmly on encouraging states to boost housing supply. What role do you think the federal government should be playing to help alleviate the housing crisis? Should it be looking at tax incentives, for example?
Well, the tax incentives that we have at the moment are incentivising us in completely the wrong direction, because if we look at negative gearing, for instance, but even the generous tax concessions that owner-occupiers enjoy, they are all overwhelmingly pumping up the price of our existing housing stock and not actually generating the new housing supply that we need even in the broader market. So yes, looking at how we use our tax system to incentivise investment in new and affordable housing production would be, a transformative step. But more fundamentally, if we're going to start to address the backlog of housing need, we're going to have to increase the amount of funding that we invest in the social and affordable housing sector. And that is also absolutely critical to lift the housing supply that we need in Australia as well.
And what do you think the consequences will be if Australia doesn't get this right, if housing continues to just get more and more expensive for some people?
Look, the consequences will ricochet across our economy. I mean, in terms of economic productivity, at the more granular level, we know that employer groups are struggling now to find workers because they can't access decent housing anywhere within striking distance of where they work. We see lower levels of women's participation in the workforce. So we start to see a whole breakdown across many areas of society.
Nicole Gurran is a Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Sydney. Well, those lucky enough to already have a roof over their heads and own their own homes will have no doubt noticed the cost of insurance has been rising. Thanks to back-to-back natural disasters and big increases in building costs, there are fears growing numbers of Australians simply can't afford to keep paying their premiums, especially those in flood-prone areas. 7:30 shone a spotlight on the issue this week when it tracked down householders facing possible premium increases in the thousands and even tens of thousands of dollars.
It gives you a bit of a hit because, when you're earning money, your money's going up. But when you're semi-retired or retired, you're just covering costs and keeping level. But your running costs are still going up, it's really difficult.
I will say it's cheaper to build my property. I will say that I have less contents than I really do. I will under-insure the property to keep insurance on the property. The average Australian who gets up in the morning, goes to work and comes home, is not going to be able to look at insurance premiums of $30,000+.
Thankfully, most don't face such extreme rises, but research conducted for the Actuaries Institute has found an increase of around 28% in premiums in just 1 year.
I haven't seen an increase like that in home insurance for 20 years. We'd expect maybe 3, 4, 5% year to year, but not 28%. That's the first time I've seen that large amount for home insurance.
Shiranjit Padam worked on the research and says about 1.25 million households are struggling to pay for cover.
Yeah, so what we do is we look at how many weeks of the household income would it take to pay your insurance. And what we found is that 1.25 million households across Australia have insurance premiums that are more than 1 month of the household income. And we think that's unlikely to be affordable for those households.
We've heard a lot about the cost of living lately and the cost of building materials in particular. Is that the driving factor behind these increases in insurance costs?
It's half of the story. It costs a lot more to fix or build a house, and that flows through to higher insurance claims costs, which flows through to higher insurance premiums for the customer. But the other half of it, the other 14%, is very much driven by the sequence of natural disasters we had. So 2022 is one of the largest insurance losses Australia has ever seen from the multiple floods we saw across the country. And what that does is it drives up the reinsurance costs for insurers. So insurers buy their own insurance from reinsurers, and those reinsurers have made substantial losses 5 out of the last 6 years. And so they are pushing through higher prices to try and get to a more sustainable level for their business. And then that flows through higher costs for insurers, which flows through to higher premiums for the consumer here.
Right. So some of the figures being quoted seem very high, but from what you're saying, it seems like the prices are probably roughly fair. Is there insurance price gouging going on, or is this just reflecting what's been happening in Australia?
Yeah, so we looked at APRA statistics, so the regulator statistics for home insurance in Australia. And when we look at those statistics, for the last 3 years, the insurance industry has been making a loss on home insurance. So there's no evidence from that would suggest that insurers are overcharging. In fact, they're undercharging insurance is what's happened in the last 3 years.
What type of disaster costs the most to insure against? I'm assuming it's a flood.
It generally is the natural disasters, floods, bushfire as well. And of course, cyclones and storms can have damage. Storms tend to be quite frequent, but less severe. One picture is in northern Australia, where the exposure to cyclones does put a lot of pressure on insurance premiums and generally lower levels of income. So we see that up in North Queensland and parts of the Northern Territory and northern Western Australia. The other people who I think are struggling are those with exposures to flood. And these tend to be along inland rivers, so inland New South Wales, inland Queensland, but also in other places like the Riverlands, South Australia. Mm-hmm. And also in Western Sydney and sort of the Windsor area in the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley, there's a significant exposure to flood in that area, and we're seeing very high premiums.
We've been told a lot that climate change is going to make some of these extreme events you're talking about more common and potentially more severe. Are insurance companies already pricing in the risk for that, the risk that these events are going to be more common and more severe?
Yeah, so generally no. So insurers are trying to price contracts for the next year. And so they're looking at the risk in a very short term. Climate change generally has a much larger effect over a longer period of time. So insurers aren't thinking about climate change in 10 years' time and then putting the prices up today. Competition in the market forces them to keep prices as relevant to the next 12-month period as they can. But I would say that climate change is already affecting insurance costs. At the Actuaries Institute, we look at the Australian Actuaries Climate Index, and we look at the frequency and severity of extreme weather, and that is showing a very, very clear signal that these types of severe weather events are getting more frequent and more severe in Australia. And the main challenge for insurers is to make sure that their prices today have allowed enough for what has already happened with climate change, not what's going to happen in the future with climate change.
If the cost of insurance is so high, rebuilding is so expensive, does that then also reduce the pool of money that we might have now to prepare for these disasters in the future? Because we talk a lot about ensuring that towns and cities are resilient as climate change occurs.
Yes, we know that spending money on resilience measures, so making houses safer and more protected against these disasters, is very cost effective. The figures vary, but numbers up to $8 for every dollar you spend on resilience, you can save in disaster costs down the line. So it is generally, the right strategy is to make our houses more resilient to future disasters. It is expensive though. I do want to underline that. So you still need to pay for builders to make a house more resilient, so you don't avoid the building cost inflation, but it is better to spend the money on that. So this has been a big change that we've seen with the new federal government. Previously, the federal government would fund about $26 million a year for resilience measures, which compared to, say, $7 billion of loss last year is a drop in the ocean. But we've seen the new federal government, one of the very first announcements they made was to start funding resilience across the country. They've put in $200 million a year, and that's matched by states, and they have a 5-year program for that. It's called a Disaster Ready Fund, and we're already seeing the first bout of funding coming out of that is allowing the state governments to use that money to improve resilience at a household level.
Shiranjit Padam is an expert on climate risk at Finity. Now, it is a familiar refrain from mums and dads across the nation who will plead with their kids daily to eat up their greens. But how well are we all doing when it comes to tucking into our vegetables? Ask most people and they might tell you they're pretty good at eating the right stuff.
I certainly do eat my veggies. I like them very much. Yesterday, I had a bowl of Brussels sprouts and bacon with it.
We eat broccolis, carrots, and try to add some green leafy vegetables to our vegetables. Yeah.
Lettuce, tomato, cucumber, carrot, capsicum, olives, pickles.
Definitely, we have veggies probably 5 days a week at home.
But are we kidding ourselves? This week, the nation's science agency, the CSIRO, delivered its verdict on that very question, following a long-term study of our eating habits. The findings are, well, a little worrying. Our healthy eating performance was rated just 55 out of 100, and only 1 in 5 of us are consuming enough vegetables.
Yeah, so at the moment, we estimate that 2 out of every 3 Australian adults are overweight or obese, and it contributes about 8% of the country's total burden of disease. So poor diet increases your risk of weight gain, and weight gain is a predictor of a number of chronic diseases, including type 2 diabetes and heart disease.
Dr. Gilly Hendry is the co-author of the CSIRO Health Diet Score.
So it's a science-based questionnaire. It's online. It's freely available for people to complete. It assesses a person's diet against our Australian dietary guidelines. The dietary guidelines give recommendations by age group and sex. And so in this way, the diet score is able to provide people with an overall diet quality score out of 100. It captures questions about the variety in your diet, the frequency and the quantity of different foods that you consume across your diet, including things like breads and cereals, dairy, fruit and veg, protein foods, but also really importantly, those discretionary or junk foods, which are really the downfall of our diet quality.
So I've just done this survey. I got 65 out of 100, which doesn't seem that good, but I can see that it's about 10 points above the average. Are you surprised that the average Australian's only scoring 55 out of 100? That's barely a pass.
Yeah, 55 out of 100, yeah, barely a pass, as you say. I guess 3 main areas with which most of us aren't doing well. It's around those discretionary foods. So we're having 2 or 3 times more than what's recommended every day. So we're really falling short of the recommendations there. If we could move those off our plate, so to speak, we would make space for increasing our healthy foods. So in particular, vegetables, fruit and dairy foods are the 3 food groups that we find people aren't consuming enough, and then healthy fats as well. And then the other area is around variety. So achieving greater vegetable consumption can come through trying to increase the variety of vegetables you have. And a really simple way to do that is trying to have 3 different types on your plate each night at dinner.
Having just done the survey, I can see that my expectations didn't quite meet reality about how well I'm eating. Do you think that a lot of people are sort of kidding themselves, perhaps? They think they're eating more healthily than they actually are.
Yeah, there's really good evidence around that, actually. We totally inflate how healthy we are. We think we consume a lot more vegetables than we do. And we don't, whether it's consciously or not, we don't report all the unhealthy or less healthy discretionary foods. Even when we are reporting our consumption of certain food, like, for example, discretionary foods, we underestimate it. For example, with takeaway foods, we might underestimate it 3-fold.
Wow. So my score's probably a lot worse.
It could be, yeah. We do, you know, in the background and a little bit technical, we do some adjustments to try to account for that misreporting or that misperception of what people think they have. But yeah, I think this may be slightly higher than what reality is even.
You've gathered data on the industries that different people work in. I had to put down my industry when I just did the questionnaire. So who's doing the worst?
Coming out down the bottom are construction workers, those working in finance or management. And what was quite interesting also was people working in beauty or fashion. So that's an industry that we might think is more health orientated. So that was probably a surprising result. On the flip side, older Australians do well. So people who are retired, people working in research, and then those working in the health and fitness industry, which is more of a relief than anything.
Yes. What would be the impact across Australia if we could lift the average diet score from, say, 55 out of 100 to closer to 80? Can you quantify what sort of difference that might actually make?
Yeah, difficult to quantify the direct impact of improvements in overall diet quality. We do know the group of Australians in this data set who were doing best. So they didn't have perfect diets, but they were doing best. They had an average score of 70, and in particular, they were eating more vegetables, fruits and dairy foods and having a much greater variety of those vegetables.
If there was one thing we could all be doing, would it be as simple as eat more vegetables?
I think, two things. So one's a decrease message and one's an increase message. So the increase message is eat more veg, but a simple way to do that is not worry about amounts. Just think about 3 different types or 3 different colours tonight on your plate and try to do that for a few weeks if you can. And the other thing is those discretionary foods. So they're taking up, I think they contribute, 35-40% of our total energy in our diets amongst Australians. So if we can just have one less a day, we have between 5 and 8 different types of discretionary foods every day. So if you want to keep your favourite, do that. But if you could just have one less discretionary food throughout the day, that would be the other simple thing that people could try to action straight away.
And that has a pretty big flow-on effect to our health, how we feel, and maybe even our burden on the health system in the long run too, right?
Totally. And I think even that immediate thing, it's difficult with diet and weight gain and weight loss because it's quite a slow thing. And then your health outcomes are there's a greater lag time between what you do now and the experience of poor health outcomes. But just reminding people, when you eat well, you do feel better. You've got a little bit more zest or vitality, and that can flow on into the amount of exercise or how active you feel and how well you sleep. And then that again, in turn, influences what you feel like eating the next day. So all of these little lifestyle behaviours, they are interconnected and really contribute to your quality of life every day, but also in the longer term.
Dr. Gilly Hendry is the co-author of the CSIRO Health Diet Score. And that's the episode for this week. Catch you next time.
You're tuned to ABC News Radio across Australia. I'm Mandy Pressland on Gadigal land. We've got a news update coming your way shortly, and then we'll take you to our broadcast partners at the BBC. Eastern Standard Time is now midday. In Central Australia, it's 11:30, and in the West, 10 o'clock.
ABC News, I'm Kerry Worthington. The law firm acting for 7 Indigenous former football players taking class action against the AFL for alleged racist abuse says it expects more to come forward. Yvette Gray reports.
Documents lodged in the Supreme Court late yesterday allege the AFL failed to protect players from and move to stop vile racial abuse on the field that resulted in life-altering damage. North Melbourne great Phil Cracker is leading the group of players who were employed between 1975 and 2022, and he says sorry doesn't cut it. Margalit Injury Lawyers Managing Principal Michelle Margalit says the players ultimately want to stamp out racism in the sport.
For too long, racial vilification has been swept under the carpet.
The AFL says it's yet to receive documents relating to the class action, but if any formal correspondence is received, it will review it.
5 days after a massive flood in the Libyan city of Derna, there's still little sign of international help. Heavy rain collapsed 2 dams, flooding the city in the east of the country and leaving at least 11,000 people dead. Murad, who's a doctor in Derna, says the lack of electricity and clean water are just some of their many problems.
The bodies, it's in everywhere, and you can get the smell from a distance. And people sometimes they carry bodies without any protection, without gloves, without masks. This is the big problem now because we are facing very dangerous disease. We are afraid from cholera or hepatitis A.
The death toll from wildfires that hit the town of Lahaina on the Hawaiian island Maui has been revised down to 97. Previously, at least 115 people were thought to have died in the disaster. Officials say Britain and Canada have imposed more sanctions on Iran ahead of the anniversary of the death of Kurdish Iranian woman Mahsa Amini in Iran's morality police custody last year. It sparked months of anti-government protests that faced an often violent crackdown. Iranian security forces have reportedly stepped up security, expecting more protests this weekend. Australian-based activist Tina Quadro-Stami says acts of defiance have continued inside Iran despite the crackdown.
The restrictions are becoming harsher because the Iranian diaspora has been inspired to speak their truth as a result of Mahsa Amini's death. And this has, invited many Western governments to place pressure upon Iran.
Queensland Health is urgently sending an experimental Hendra virus treatment to India to help treat a deadly infectious disease. Chief Health Officer Dr. John Gerard says 2 people have died and hundreds are being tested after an outbreak of the Nipah virus in the Indian state of Kerala. He says Queensland is a world leader in the management of this type of virus, and India has asked for the state's help.
Hendra and Nipah viruses are very closely related viruses. They belong to the same genus. They're effectively siblings. They look very similar as viruses. They come from bat in the same way. They spread in the same way, and they cause an illness in humans that is very similar.
WA police say they didn't explicitly oppose bail during the court appearance of the teenager who seriously injured a soccer player in a separate incident, despite the state's Attorney General saying they did. Kenneth Fenn reports.
The teenager was sentenced to more than 3 years in detention over the 2021 attack that left soccer player Danny Hodgson with a severe traumatic brain injury. He was released on a supervision order in May. He was then charged over an alleged robbery in Geraldton last month and later appeared in court. Speaking to reporters on Thursday, Attorney General John Quigley said the police opposed bail, but the court overruled the police and released him. But in a statement, police say they had refused his bail, but the prosecutor did not explicitly oppose bail in court. The government says he's since been arrested after a review by the parole board led to his supervision order being cancelled.
In sport, the Broncos will be looking to secure an NRLW finals berth when they head to Sydney to take on the Dragons. And South Sydney is pushing for the minor premiership as it gets set to host the Cowboys. Reigning AFLW premiers Melbourne will face off against the Western Bulldogs this afternoon for the Hampson Hardeman Cup. The D's have won 5 of their past 7 matchups against the Bulldogs. Adelaide will take on the Bombers for the first time. The Giants host Richmond and the Hawks take on the Dockers. And around 2,000 police officers on motorbikes from across the country have started arriving in Canberra for the wall-to-wall Ride for Remembrance. The event at the National Police Memorial commemorates officers who've died in service. That's the latest ABC News.
Checking the weather in your capital city. In Brisbane, a mostly sunny day and 26 degrees. It's now 23. Sydney, sunny and 32. You're on 27. In Canberra, sunny, 25. Your maximum, it's now 23 degrees. Melbourne, sunny and 25. It's 23 currently. Hobart, it's 14 degrees, heading for 17 and showers. Sunny in Adelaide and 24. It's now 22. Possible light shower in Perth and 22. You're on 19 degrees. And in Darwin, sunny, 34 the high. In Darwin, it's now 30 degrees. We'll have more news in half an hour here on ABC News Radio after we take you to our broadcast partners at the BBC.
تستمعون الآن إلى The Fifth Floor مع فرناك أميدي. للمزيد من الأخبار من Language Services زوروا bbcworldservice.com/fifthfloor.
That was BBC Arabic's Fethi Ben Isa, and you're on the floor, where our language service journalists share with us some of the stories that are making headlines in their part of the world. I'm your host, Farnaka Amidia, and a little later on this half of the program, we find out why so many young people in China are dropping out of the job market and moving back in with their parents.
The full-time children are young people who don't have jobs and stay at home to help their parents. They cook meals, clean rooms, and do other household chores. They don't have to pay for rent or their daily expenses. Some parents even give their children a monthly salary for helping out.
More on China's so-called full-time children in a bit. But first, let's head to Iran, where people are marking the first anniversary of the death in custody of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini. Mahsa, also known by her Kurdish name Gina, was arrested by the morality police for allegedly wearing her hijab loosely. Just a few hours later, she mysteriously fell unconscious and went into a coma while in custody. Mahsa died 3 days later on the 16th of September in a hospital in Tehran. Her death shocked the world and sparked widespread protests across the country, with women at the forefront. Now, a year later, Mahsa's mother, Mojgan Eftekhari, has given her first interview. Farzad Seyfikaran is the journalist who interviewed her. He told me how it all came about.
I am from the city of Cyprus, same city of Gina. And my uncle is a doctor, and in the small town of Cyprus, everyone knows him.
Did Mahsa's family also know your uncle?
Yes, and actually many old families knows each other in Cyprus. It's a very small town in Cyprus. And I have spoken to Gina's mother several times, explaining my project to her, and I am answering all her questions, and I'm making every effort to clarify everything for her.
So she interviewed you first. You passed the interview.
Exactly. And she seldom talks about her daughter because she became emotional very quick. And that was very hard situation always for me. And so we had a pre-interview, talking together sometimes before the final interview.
Mahsa Amini's image became so iconic. The whole world knows her. She became the symbol of one of the biggest protests ever in Iran. What did her mom tell you about Mahsa herself, the daughter, the young woman?
Mahsa was very special for her. Her mother said Mahsa didn't have many friends, and they were each other's best and closest friend. She said to me that they always spent the time together, and when she was a child, Mojgan singing lullabies and songs to her in the night until the morning. And always she bring Gina to school. And her mother also told me that she chose the name of Gina for her. That means new life. But due to school and university requirements, they had to use Mahsa on identification documents because Gina is a Kurdish name. But in the gravestone of Mahsa, you can see both names, Mahsa and Gina. And she told me that her grandfather called her Shina, which means wind in Kurdish. When Mojgan spoke these words to me, I reflected on how Mahsa had different meaning for everyone. To her mother, she was like a symbol of new life. To her friends and classmates, she was Mahsa, which means beauty of moon. And to her grandfather, she was like a gentle breeze or wind. Her mother also told me that Mahsa loved medicine and microbiology, and she wished to become a doctor. She had enrolled in university to study microbiology, and she had a plan to move to Urmia for studies after her trip in Tehran.
So Urmia is a city in northwest of Iran.
Exactly. And Mahsa had aspiration of becoming a presenter.
Like a radio and television media presenter.
Exactly, like a media presenter. And she records a voice to her mother and send it to her, and in this voice she talking about her gratitude to her mother.
Farzad, we have that clip. Let's have a listen to it.
بینندگان عزیز و شنوندگان محترم و مادر عزیز و گرامیم بنده مینا هستم.
So clearly pretending to be a media presenter, a TV and radio presenter, she greets very warmly her audience, and as you mentioned, very endearingly talks to her mother. You can feel the warmth and the love and the respect she has for her mother in that clip as well. She says, "And to my dear, respectful mother, I am Gina."
Yes.
Yeah, it's very moving to actually, as a person who's sitting behind the microphone right now in a radio studio, I found it really, really moving. How important was it for Mojgan to talk about Mahsa and her dreams and her ambitions?
Yeah, it mattered a lot. She spoke with a lot of sensitivity and love about her daughter, about Gina. She spoke very respectfully about her, and sometimes called her name, for example, Prophet of Love in sense of Gina. In Kurdi of Farsi is the Hazrat Ishq, and it was very full of feeling for me because I had an interview with a lot of family members of the victims, but her mother always finding a very special word for her daughter, and it was very new for me.
How did it feel for you? You know, you come from that part of the country, you come from the same city, you're talking to the mother of a woman whose face is known all over the world. How did it feel?
Actually, a little bit confused. I had a very good feeling, and at the same time I had a very bad feeling because when she talking about her daughter, she was very sad, but I tried to control my feeling and do the interview with her and give the information about Mahsa's life. But she always, after the few words, crying. I think this pain after 1 year is very new for her. I don't know, maybe sometimes we had a good feeling that we interviewed someone that everyone wants to interview him or her, but I don't know that I'd be happy for this interview or not.
Yeah, you might feel privileged to be able to have this one-to-one, but yeah, it's hard to be happy to talk to someone who's in so much pain and grief. Farzad, when the news of her death in police custody was out, were you surprised by the reaction of people, or did you expect such huge anger and widespread protests to happen across the country?
Huge anger because last year we had a lot of news about the behavior of the morality police in Iran against the women. And exactly 1 week before Mahsa's death, we had also a woman in Kurdistan province. Her name is Shiler Rasouli. Someone tried to rape her and she fell down from the window in the second floor and she was dead. The police arrested this man, but after a few days he was freed. And this made everybody so angry, especially the feminist women, and they made a protest against this situation and published statements against the police because the police not protect the women, and also morality police was a part of the violence against the women.
So the situation was already volatile and tense in Kurdistan.
Exactly, and after this, the funeral ceremony of Jina was so important. Thousands of the people of the small city like Saqqez went in this funeral chanting the women life freedom, and nationwide protest starts very quick. But maybe everybody surprised that they make a very big protest due to the women issue, like a hijab, not, for example, for economical issues.
So Farzad, what is happening right now in Saqqez as we're speaking? Because I was watching videos of like security forces, like caravans of cars driving towards Kurdistan. Can you tell us about the clampdown that is happening and whether anyone from the security forces have also approached Mahsa's family members?
Yes, there is a very bad situation. I received a lot of footages that show the security forces installed the CCTV cameras in every street and alleys. Also in Aichi Cemetery, where Mahsa's grave is.
So they're like trying to make sure that people don't gather in the cemetery and in the city.
Yeah, exactly. And also Mahsa's young uncle was arrested 10 days ago, and till now nobody knows where he is. Mahsa's father also has been summoned to the intelligence services of Iran maybe 4 times, I think.
Farzad, you just like me cannot go back to Iran because of the work we do. So you have to just sit back here and watch what is unfolding in Iran and in your own city. But do you still feel part of it in some way?
Yeah, but now I'm very sad because a lot of my friends in the past days was arrested and now they are in prison. And my relation with my family and with my friends is too bad at this moment because I know that my work have a risk for them. And sometimes they didn't answer my messages, and I know why, because they are worried about things, and that makes me sad. And my heart and my mind always in Iran, thinking about situation in Iran, about the people, about the protest. But I'm here, I cannot do nothing, just reporting. And I hope my reporting make the situation a little bit better for them, but I'm not sure.
Thank you to Farzad Seifi-Karan for sharing his experience of interviewing the mother of Mahsa Amini for BBC Persian. If you want to find out more, a BBC film based on his interview, Mahsa, Her Untold Story, is out on Saturday. You're still with us on the 5th floor. And now let's head to China, where a growing number of recent college graduates are struggling to find jobs. The competition in the job market is fierce, and once you get a job, the working culture is relentless, making it very difficult for young people to have a work-life balance. Sylvia Chang from BBC Chinese talked to some young people who have found different solutions. First, she told me about the challenges they face.
At this moment, the job market is very competitive, and there aren't enough suitable opportunities for them. We can say that this summer, social media in China have been filled with graduation photos that reflect the disappointment of fresh graduates. So in some pictures, the young people are wearing graduation gowns and lying down with their faces covered by mortarboards. And some are holding their graduation certificates over trash bins, ready to throw them away. There are many reasons behind this. So in China, the economy is recovering at a slower pace than expected, leading to high unemployment rates.
Recovering from COVID, you mean?
Yes, recovery from COVID. Meanwhile, the crackdowns on industries popular among young people in China have also affected the job market. For example, there are regulations targeting tech companies and restrictions on the tutoring industry and a ban on foreign investments in private education. These have all led to job losses.
For those young people who actually do find a job, it seems they also, after a while, feel disillusioned. Can you tell us about the job culture a little and, this 996 culture?
The 996 working culture is like you start working at 9 o'clock in the morning, end up at 9 o'clock in the evening, and you're working 6 days every week. It's not fair. Actually, it's banned by law in China. But actually, there is not enough enforcement. And also, in the working culture, that's very competitive. If they don't work harder to do those long hours, they are fearing that they may be fired.
Sylvia, you reported about the growing number of young people who are starting to look for jobs outside of China and actually Africa as a popular destination. Tell us what you discovered.
I won't say that Africa is a popular place for them to work. It's a choice. It's a new choice for them. So in the past, Africa was not even considered as a choice for many graduates because of language barriers, security concerns, and the cultural differences. But in recent years, there has been a growing interest in working in Africa. Meanwhile, the African continent has become a promising opportunity for young Chinese because the trade between China and Africa continues to grow.
So Sylvia, tell me about some of the stories you heard, some of the experiences these young people have had in African countries.
I talked to 3 young people from China. The first person was a 20-year man who has just graduated. This person is the oldest brother in his family and lives in a village. He needs to find a job as soon as possible to support his family. So he decided to accept a job offer in Ghana, in West Africa. And the second person I spoke with is a fresh graduate from Central China. He chose to work in Zambia instead of China. He did receive some job offers within China, but he didn't like the working culture, just like what I have said, the long hours and the high stress. That's why he's trying to find a place where he can at least have some life and work balance. I also spoke to a young woman who found a job as an accountant in Congo. She describes her journey to Africa as an act of rebellion. She was from a small town in southern China, and her family expected her to settle down and get married. But she wants to live independently, so the more her family pushes her, the stronger she wants to run away.
Sylvia, you also talked to another group of people. They are nicknamed the full-time children. Tell us about them.
The full-time children are young people who don't have jobs and stay at home to help their parents. They cook meals, clean rooms, and do other household chores. They don't have to pay for rent or their daily expenses. Some parents even give their children a monthly salary for helping out. But many full-time children still want to work, so they also spend their free time applying for jobs or doing part-time work.
What did they tell you about the attitude of their parents towards them staying at home and living with them?
Yeah, it's interesting to find that most of the people who are speaking out are women. For the full-time sons, probably they're ashamed of their experience. So most of the women I spoke with, they are the only child in the family due to China's one-child policy. They said that their parents understand their choice. Their parents believe that the job market is highly competitive and feel that their daughter needs a balance between work and life. They don't want their child to work all day and night without having time for fun or enjoy life. Also interesting, a young woman told me that her parents support her choice of staying at home because they want her to have time to find a boyfriend. She's almost 30 years old. Her parents is worried about her future in finding a good partner.
So how different is the situation of these young people, looking for jobs and trying to develop their career compared to what their parents experienced a few decades ago?
I would say it was a completely different time. Back then, the government decided where people would work. And the people of that era had to obey the government's instructions. Otherwise, they won't receive the benefits of being a university graduate. That's quite different from the current situation.
So what does the Chinese government say about youth unemployment publicly, and what are their policies or their plans to tackle this?
I think the government is aware of the problems, but they are trying to make it seem less serious. In August, the government said that they will no longer publish data on youth unemployment rate. That was after it reached a record high. The state-run media also have tried to change what we think about unemployment. For example, in an article, they used the term, quote-unquote, slow employment, meaning that even if you haven't found a job yet, or if you decide to continue your education, learn new skills, or take time off before working, you are still considered employed. And the article advised people to take action and work harder. And as long as they do that, there is no need to worry about being jobless. But I think the young people has already trying very hard. As a young man told me that he sent out 1,000 applications, but still there is no job suitable for him.
Wow, 1,000 applications and still no job. That's incredible. Thank you to Sylvia Chang from BBC Chinese, speaking to me all the way from Hong Kong. If you've just joined us, don't forget that you can catch up with this episode or find other editions of The Fifth Floor on our webpage. Just search BBC Fifth Floor and head to the episodes page. Don't go away, there's still plenty more to come here on The Fifth Floor after this latest BBC News.
Has been broken apart, pummeled to within an inch of its life. There is no violence on behalf of the protesters. I'm confident that this is something that people can accomplish.
Up to the minute news and current affairs from across Australia and around the world. Know the story with ABC News Radio.
And thanks for joining us here on ABC News Radio. I'm Mandy Pressland. It is time for a news update before we return to our broadcast partners at the BBC. Eastern Standard Time is now 12:30. In Central Australia, it's midday, and in the West, 10:30.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
The law firm acting on behalf of 7 Indigenous former football players taking class action against the AFL for alleged racist abuse says it expects more players to come forward. North Melbourne great Phil Cracker is leading the group, who alleges the AFL failed to protect them and stop vile racial abuse on the field that resulted in life-altering damage to the players. Documents were lodged in the Supreme Court late yesterday. The AFL says it hasn't yet received formal notification of the action. Margalit Injury Lawyers Managing Principal Michelle Margalit says the affected players ultimately want to stamp out racism in the sport.
There has been reports from more recent players that say it's not a safe work environment for Aboriginal, Indigenous or persons of colour. So the number one goal of this class action is to ensure that within the AFL this culture of violence is eradicated.
The Australian government will give $1 million in humanitarian assistance following the deadly floods in Libya. Heavy rain saw 2 dams collapse. flooding the coastal city of Derna and killing more than 11,000 people. Another 10,000 people remain unaccounted for. The Australian government says the money will be used to provide food, water, blankets and medical supplies to the region. The senior bushfire researcher in the Northern Territory says climate change is affecting fire seasons. A fire to the east of Tennant Creek burnt more than 10 million hectares over the past week. The Darwin Centre for Bushfire Research senior researcher Dr. Andrew Edwards says the impact of climate change is tangible.
That window of opportunity to do the prescribed burning is getting smaller because we're getting more extremes of hot and dry weather coming on sooner in the dry season, and the wet season itself not being as big sometimes and therefore not leaving as much moisture in the soil. So again, that window gets smaller.
The Rural Fire Service says leftover smoke from hazard reduction burns should mostly clear ahead of tomorrow's Sydney Marathon CBD. To the weather now, and the current temperatures in our capitals. In Brisbane it's 23 degrees, Sydney you're on 29, in Canberra it's 23 now in Melbourne, Hobart 13, Adelaide 23, in Perth it's 19 degrees and in Darwin it's 32 degrees. We'll have another news update for you in just under half an hour after we take you to the BBC.
Slušate The Fifth Floor sa Faranak Amidi. Skinite naš podcast sa našeg websajta na bbcworldservice.com/fifthfloor.
Thank you, Alexander Miladinovic from BBC Serbian, for welcoming us back on The Fifth Floor, where we take you around the world in just under an hour with the stories making headlines in our language services. I'm your host, Farna Kamidi, still to come on this half, we'll take a tour of the North Korean leader's private train. But first, let's turn our attention to Morocco, where rescue teams are still struggling to get help to some of the areas worst affected by last week's earthquake, which struck in the Atlas Mountains. Complete villages were destroyed, and the damage to roads and tracks left many cut off. BBC Arabic's Saida Badri's own town was affected by the earthquake, and she shares the same Berber or Amazigh heritage as the people of the Atlas Mountains. She joins me now. Thank you very much, Saida. Saida, before we get to what's happening in Morocco, this has been a week of tragedy for North Africa, with the floods in Libya happening just a few days after this earthquake. How is the BBC Arabic newsroom coping with such huge stories?
Yes, it's a really catastrophic situation in Libya. It's like 2 days after the earthquake in Morocco, the flood happened. BBC Arabic follows the story of Libyan flood as well as one of the top headlines. And it's a big tragedy. It's like more than 11,000 died, so and still people missing. It's almost Derna is the city, half of it is vanished. So already like a few months ago we covered the story in Turkish and Syria. It's the same feeling, sadness, it's really sad. I mean, people, they can't handle it anymore on an emotional level. And few months that happened in Morocco on last Friday, and again in Libya. People, in the newsroom, they feel so, they can't handle it. Just now, one of my colleagues upstairs, I can't watch the videos anymore because it's full of cry, full of pain, people that just one family, one person, he lost all the family, and another one was trying to get his son from one of the bodies. So it's really, another one was crying, his mom on the floor. It's emotionally, it's people that can't carry on. I mean, colleagues, journalists, they can't carry on with that. And we
that's
think
something that a lot of people don't understand about working in newsrooms.
Exactly, because even if people, they are not on the ground, but they feel so sympathy and empathy with the people on the ground.
And you're going through these footages and interviews all day, for hours. It's very difficult. Now, I want to come to the earthquake in Morocco. For you, it actually hits very close to home. Tell me about it.
Yes, because the epicenter is in the Atlas Mountains, and the Atlas Mountains are huge. chain of mountains that separates the desert Sahara with the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean. So, and people, my hometown, I'm from Gulmima, and my hometown is within the mountain atlas, and it's a bit far, about 550 kilometers. So, from the epicenter. So they felt it, and my family, so sudden for what happened as Amazigh, because people live in the Atlas Mountains, they're called Amazigh. So we have similar we share similar traditions, language, and background, and everything. So it's really sad what's going on. Plus the area, they have common things as nature, as a culture, is agriculture places. They rely on earth, on land, or they produce. So attached to each other, though they speak different dialects, but still it's Amazigh.
It must be so hard for you being so far away and having to report on it. Tell me about how you heard about the earthquake first.
That night, it was on the 8th of September. I was working on a night shift from home. And at 11 night, I just checked on Instagram, and they saw people posting sentences like, you felt it, it's an earthquake. And automatically, I called my sister. It was 11. I said, is an earthquake there? What happened? She said, yes, it's strong. And she was so scared because already my sister, she doesn't feel well she's not well. So with the earthquake, she felt more. So, okay, fine. I tried to call my family again in Rabat. I called them, they felt it as well. So the whole Morocco, almost cities, they felt it.
That's how strong
so
it was.
I experienced like mixed of feelings, fear, worry, because I'm here. If something worse happened, how can I reach them so quick? And I was working on a night shift. I don't know, but it was hard and really bad experience, to be honest. Horrible experience.
I can imagine. We are hearing about reports all week about how difficult it has been to get aid to a lot of these places that have been hit by the earthquake. Can you describe the landscape of that region for us so we get a better understanding of what is happening?
The villages, the Atlas Mountains, is it has many villages, okay? They are scattered and numerous villages. It's almost it's like hell on top of the Atlas Mountains. It's a narrow path and road. It's mountain on the one side and it on the other side.
Wow.
And it only allows one car. So to reach the aid to the people on top of the mountain, it's hard. And many people, they rely on donkeys and mules so as they can reach between villages. And most of people, they rely walking more, like hiking, so they can reach to their families and stuff. And they saw people, they took the aid like on their shoulders so as they can reach the people on top. Until now, there are some villages, they still have no aid yet because the road is not it's not proper and safe, because there are some slab of mountain they still coming down and they block the roads. It's so damaged because of the earthquake. And the government, they try to help them and to send aid using helicopters and planes, but still they can't cover.
And Saida, it seems that this part of Morocco has been neglected in the past as far as infrastructure and other kinds of development. Has that been highlighted by this earthquake? Is that something that people are talking about in the news and elsewhere?
Exactly, because long time, that area they lived in, we can say they were forgotten. All right, no infrastructure. The government provide them with the minimum of the minimum. They have like electricity, few hours a day and stuff. Water, they still don't have water. So with what happened now with the earthquake, the local association, they shed a light on the bad situation. People are living there for years and years, and no one was looking after what they need, what they are looking for. Some NGOs, they visit that area from time to time, but they can't cover the needs, the whole of it. Recently, only yesterday, there was like a government meeting, and they said they will look after the area to fix it and to help people with the rebuild and stuff. But again, it's a long talk to go ahead with to help them.
Thank you very much, Saida Badri. That was Saida Badri from BBC Arabic talking about the coverage of the earthquake in Morocco by the newsroom of BBC Arabic. Thank you very much. You're still with us on the 5th floor. Now, many world leaders and the rich and famous prefer to travel on private jets, but not the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. He has a private train, and recently he took that train to Russia's Far East for talks with President Vladimir Putin. And he is not alone. He was also known to take long foreign trips almost exclusively by train. We spoke to Yoona Koo of BBC Korean about the history of the elusive train of Kim Jong-un.
The train is called Taeyang-ho. Taeyang means sun and Ho means train in North Korea. The sun symbolizes North Korea's founder, Kim Il-sung, who is Kim Jong-un's grandfather. Experts have been guessing there are two other trains that look alike to cause confusion tracking whereabouts of the North Korean leader. What can we say for sure is that the train has carried 3 generations of the Kim family across the country and on occasional overseas trips for decades. Kim Il-sung's the grandfather of Kim Jong-un. His locomotive journeys include visits to Vietnam and Eastern Europe. And Kim Jong-un's father was reportedly afraid of flying, so he relied almost solely on the train. One of the longest journeys by Kim Jong-il included a trip from Pyongyang to Moscow in 2001, which took 24 days to cover 20,000 kilometer distance. This is believed to be Kim Jong-un's first trip outside North Korea in more than 4 years because of COVID. Kim Jong-un reached the Russian border station of Hasan. Hasan station is known to be the only path from Pyongyang to Russia. So there have been many stops made at this station to change the train's wheels. North Korea and Russia have different train gauges. So the distance between the rails is wider in Russia compared to that of North Korea. So in order to ride on Russian trail, North Korean train has to change its wheel. You might think the train is quite oriental when it comes to its design, but actually it looks quite Western. The train is painted in stark dark green color, emblazoned with yellow stripes. We have limited information about the interior of the train, but according to several North Korean media outlets, they're like the 5-star hotel and at the same time office place where Kim Jong-un can do almost everything that he can do in his place in North Korea. A video released in 2018 showed Kim Jong-un meeting with top Chinese officials in a train car. The interior is quite extravagant, sometimes decorated with flower-shaped lighting and even zebra-printed fabric. The main reason for choosing train is because of security. It's not only Kim Jong-un, but all the Kim family, including his father and grandfather, was paranoid about their security. And because the aeroplanes owned by the Kim family in North Korea is quite old, they are worried about the safety of the planes. Also, they think it's more trackable. Because the train is heavily armored, the train goes at an average speed of 60 kilometers an hour. The bottom part of the train is equipped with heavy bulletproof materials, making this train so heavy. There are several rooms which security agents use, and whenever the train passes different stations, the security agents go before the train arrives at the station to see whether everything is safe and clear. The most famous memoir of a person who actually took the train is Russian military commander Konstantin Pulikovsky, and he accompanied former North Korean leader Kim Jong-il on 2001 trip to Moscow. According to his memoir called Orient Express, it was possible to order any dish of Russian, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and French cuisine, red wine from France, and live laughters as well.
I'm Su Ping, a BBC Chinese journalist currently working with BBC Monitoring. There's another famous leader who also preferred to travel by train. Chairman Mao's first foreign trip was by train, just 2 months after forming the People's Republic of China in October 1949. And interestingly, it was to Moscow when he visited Joseph Stalin, then leader of the Soviet Union. The train, which would become known as Mao's first special train, was coded 9002. It left Beijing on the 6th of December and arrived at Moscow on the 16th. So the whole journey took 10 days. This very train was originally a gift from the United States. Mao would go on to use his special trains for almost all of his travel and political engagements in China. A quick search on Google would return many photos of Mao sipping tea, smoking, reading briefings, hosting meetings aboard his trusty train. Now, one article from early 2023 on the National Defense Education website said, from March 1949 to April 1975, when Mao made his final tour of South China, he took the special trains a total of 72 times, working and living on trains for 2,148 days. That is a whopping total of 6 years, 10 months and 21 days. The total distance covered was over 3.4 million kilometers. When he came back from whatever engagements to the train, he would always say, "I'm home." The reasons of Mao's preference to travel by train are widely speculated on in China. For security reasons, the party banned Mao from flying, or Mao himself was scared of flying, or he didn't like flying on foreign planes. In fact, there have been reports of several attempted attacks on Mao's train, including on the one he took to Moscow. In 2011, Chinese media gave another explanation of Mao's preference to travel by train. Reports quoted Mao's former confidential secretary. Traveling on trains allowed Mao to stop and interact and engage with people more easily. She recalled Mao used to say, "You have control. Stop when you want, leave when you want. You can get off and have a look or talk to local leaders." As for Mao's train itself, the interior of the train certainly appeared comfortable. Plush carpeting, soft furnishings, it certainly offered pleasant and cozy ambience. However, its appearance from the outside closely resembled trains of that era in China, known as the green trains that my generation grew up with and travelled on. Although they may evoke a sense of romance, nostalgia, often provided a noisy and somewhat bumpy ride. I wonder, as such a fan of travelling by train, if Mao had lived today, would he have embraced China's sleek Gaotie, the bullet trains, or stuck to the traditional green locomotive, just like Kim Jong-un?
I gotta say, I liked imagining the interior of Kim's luxury train, especially the zebra ones. I actually Googled it to see them. Thank you, Yuna Koo of BBC Korean and Su Ping from BBC Monitoring for telling us about the private trains of Kim Jong-un and Mao Zedong. And that's all from the Fifth Floor today. From me, Farna Kamiti, and the rest of the Fifth Floor team, thanks for listening.
You're listening to Witness History on the BBC World Service with me, Jill Kersley. It's 30 years since the Oslo Accords were signed. This agreement in 1993 aimed to bring about peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. This week, we're bringing you stories from Israeli and Palestinian history. Today, I'm taking you back to August 2005, when an orchestra was preparing to perform an extraordinary concert. A concert which would see Israeli musicians perform in the Palestinian city of Ramallah.
As soon as the first note was played, there were no more Israelis, no more Palestinians, no more Jews, no more Arabs. They were just musicians.
That's Daniel Cohen. He's Israeli. And this is Taim Flavey, who is Palestinian. They've both grown up amidst conflict.
I can safely say I think it was a life-changing experience for everyone.
Tame and Daniel were both violinists who performed in this unusual concert in the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. In 1999, Israeli conductor, the maestro Daniel Barenboim, and the Palestinian literary critic and philosopher Edward Said founded the orchestra. It was made up of young Arab and Israeli musicians. The founders' belief was that music has the power to bring people together.
I obviously had encountered many Israelis before. Being under occupation, it's kind of given. Anytime you want to cross a checkpoint, you have to come face to face with an Israeli. So, as a Palestinian, it's kind of unavoidable.
I've certainly never met a Palestinian before, only seen them in the news as really people who want our destruction. I remember, Tame was the first Palestinian I've ever met.
Despite their different backgrounds, the two became friends. They sat next to each other when travelling and were paired together to do interviews with the orchestra. They also discussed politics. Because of the mixture of Arab and Israeli musicians, not everything within the orchestra was always harmonious. Here's cellist Elena Chia talking to the BBC in 2009.
There have been many times when there was an official discussion and then somebody said, okay, let's call it a day. And then you see everybody dividing up into their factions, talking very heatedly about what just happened.
However, when the orchestra played together, they forgot their differences. The maestro wanted to take them to a Palestinian city of Ramallah in 2004, but it didn't happen that year.
I've kind of grown used to the idea that every year there'll be a little butterflies in the stomach that we might go to a place that I would consider less safe, but was always thinking that it never really works, because what lunatic would take almost 100 young people to a place where they can guarantee their safety? But of course I wasn't counting on the spirit and the tenacity of Daniel Barenboim.
Finally, the maestro confirmed they would have their trip to Ramallah in August 2005.
I felt that I wanted to trust his instincts more than mine, and with a very split heart decided to go on this journey.
For me, of course, I was going back home, so it wasn't a very difficult conversation to have in that sense.
Tame understood, though, that for the Israeli musicians it was difficult.
They are not allowed to. It's actually illegal to go. On the Israeli side, Ramallah is not even a 40-minute drive from Tel Aviv. It's that close, and yet it could be as if it were at the end of the world. The image that many, I think, had in their mind was just full of terrorists, I think.
The concert was planned at the end of the orchestra's tour, where they had spent a month flying all over the world. But it was not possible for all the musicians to travel together to Ramallah.
We were separated into the group that went to the Arab countries, and the Israelis, of course, went through East Jerusalem.
So the Spanish government had supported this concert 100% and decided to grant all members of the orchestra Spanish diplomatic passports for this trip. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked.
Daniel and Tame headed to the Ramallah concert via different routes.
When we entered the city, there was a curfew, and we were driving in a convoy of bulletproof UN cars, UN jeeps.
How did it feel to be so heavily guarded?
I was certainly grateful, as it was quite clear that what we were doing was not to everyone's taste on both sides. But it didn't feel good, it didn't feel safe. It really brought home the problematics of the conflict.
The Arab musicians crossed and were able to stay. The Israeli musicians were brought in on the day of the concert.
That day was the 21st of August 2005. Daniel and the other Israeli musicians arrived at the concert venue, the Cultural Palace in Ramallah.
and were extremely warmly received there. We had a morning rehearsal, and then sat on the grass and played the sheshbesh, played the board games with the Palestinian security guard.
Really, no one was supposed to leave the premises. There was a catered lunch, an amazing catered lunch,
So what was on the menu for lunch then?
Well, all the good stuff.
Real hard, handmade food, which I will never forget. It was the tastiest thing I've ever eaten. Food is how we show love in the Middle East.
The time came for the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, made up of Arab and Israeli musicians, to take to the stage.
I could not fathom that this is taking place, but it really was. And at the same time, none of us as musicians could afford to be completely carried away by the flood of emotions and realizations of, we are here playing. I think that the energy was even more because of the context in this case.
And Maestro Daniel Barenboim made a passionate speech.
It is our duty, all of us, to find a way to live together, because either we all kill each other or we learn to share what there is to share. It is with this message that we have come to you today.
He did not only give that speech to the Palestinian audience that was sitting before him, he would have given the same speech also, or the message was also kind of implied that it is also for the Israelis.
There were tears in the eyes of both the musicians and audience members. For Taim, performing in her home city meant it was the first time she had played with so many people she knew in the audience. She waited to meet up with them after the concert. But for Daniel, it was different.
With the last note of the concert, the audience stayed put, and the Israelis got back in the bulletproof cars, another curfew on Ramallah, and driven out of Ramallah immediately. So only when we crossed the border out of Ramallah could the audience leave the home.
A concert that many thought would be impossible had become reality.
That buzzing feeling still, I can recall it really well, even all of those years later.
A rare gesture of the collaboration that could make our little corner of the world a heaven rather than a hell.
Taim Flaifey and Daniel Cohen remain good friends. They were speaking to me, Jill Kersley, for that edition of Witness History.
ABC News Radio, Australia's only 24-hour radio news network. Local, national and international stories. Independent, live, up-to-the-minute coverage. On broadcast, streaming and the ABC Listen app. Know the story with ABC News Radio.
And thanks for joining us here on ABC News Radio. We've got a news update coming your way shortly. Our analogue listeners in the ACT, New South Wales and Queensland will have AFLW coverage as the GWS Giants play Richmond in Blacktown. Regular news radio programming continues on digital radio and television, online and on your mobile through the ABC Listen app. If you want to stay with us, you can do so for the latest news update with Eastern Standard Time at 1 o'clock, Central Australia, 12:30. In the West, it's now 11 o'clock.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
The law firm acting for 7 Indigenous former football players taking class action against the AFL for alleged racist abuse denies deliberately timing the legal action to coincide with the footy finals period. Documents lodged in the Supreme Court late yesterday allege the AFL failed to protect players from and moved to stop vile racial abuse on the field, resulted in life-altering damage to players. North Melbourne great Phil Cracker, who is leading the group of players employed between 1975 and 2022, says they were deeply affected by the comments and the AFL has the power to stop it ever happening again. Margalit Injury Lawyers Managing Principal Michelle Margalit says she expects more players to come forward now that the class action has been made public.
We have not picked this time. That's
the fact of the matter. It is important timing. We hope that this case will garner sufficient attention to bring these issues to the forefront. We need people to talk about this. We need improvement, and the more people that are aware of it, the better.
Crowds have gathered at Victoria Square in Adelaide's CBD to support the yes vote for an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Australians have until this Monday to enrol to vote in the upcoming referendum on October 14. Today's event in Adelaide is the first of a series of marches to be held by the Yes campaign across the country this weekend. Federal Social Services Minister Amanda Rishworth says South Australia has always been at the forefront of progressive change.
South Australia was critical in the 1967 referendum. We have now the first state to have legislated already a South Australian voice to Parliament, and we will see South Australia playing such a critical role in this referendum coming up.
International aid is yet to arrive in force in Libya 5 days after massive floods devastated communities in the east of the country. Heavy rain saw 2 dams collapse, flooding the coastal city of Derna, leaving more than 11,000 people dead. Another 10,000 accounted for. Major General Ahmed al-Mazari from the Libyan National Army says damage to roads leading into the region is hampering relief efforts.
Due to the intensity and abundance of the rains, everything was washed away, the roads, bridges and footbridges. The waters have completely cut off the roads in these regions, and hundreds of kilometres of them require major repairs.
The US, Britain and Canada have imposed more sanctions on Iran ahead of the anniversary of the death of Kurdish-Iranian woman Mahsa Amini in Iran's morality police custody last year. It sparked months of anti-government protests that faced an often violent crackdown. Iranian security forces have reportedly stepped up security, expecting more protests this weekend. Australian-based activist Tina Kodros-Domini says acts of defiance have continued inside Iran despite the crackdown.
The restrictions are becoming harsher because the Iranian diaspora has been inspired to speak their truth as a result of Mahsa Amini's death. And this has, invited many Western governments to place pressure upon Iran.
Queensland Health is urgently sending an experimental Hendra virus treatment to India to help treat a deadly infectious disease. Chief Health Officer Dr. John Gerard says 2 people have died and hundreds are being tested after an outbreak in the Nipah virus in the Indian state of Kerala. He says Queensland is a world leader in the management of this type of virus, and India has asked for the state's help.
Hendra and Nipah viruses are very closely related viruses. They belong to the same genus. They're effectively siblings. They look very similar as viruses. They come from bat in the same way, they spread in the same way, and they cause an illness in humans that is very similar.
New South Wales Premier Chris Minns says a $224 million housing package as part of the state budget will make a dent in the housing affordability crisis. The money will be split between social housing construction and emergency funding for homelessness services. To the weather now in our capitals and in Brisbane, mostly sunny and 26 degrees. Currently in Brisbane, it's 24. In Sydney, sunny and 32. You're on 29 degrees. Canberra, sunny and 25. It's now 24.
And that day had been rooted in an urgent sense of generational loss. I began by asking her to tell me more about a conversation that she had described to the court, which took place between herself and her grandfather some years ago. And that day had been rooted in an urgent sense.
Update from the COP, I think it was COP25, and it was of the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister of Tuvalu, saying, if we save Tuvalu, we save the world. And it was then that I realized, okay, climate change will disproportionately affect Pacific Island nations. So what does that mean for us, for people like my grandfather who cherishes his homeland? And what does that mean for me as a younger person who only has so many years to become closer to her culture and to people she loves from Tuvalu? What would that mean? So I asked him about how he felt about the idea that Tuvalu may not exist one day and may become inundated by the sea. And as you probably know, his answer was, it will never be gone. And at that time, I remember thinking, I wonder if he means physically, like it will physically never be gone, or if it meant culturally it would remain and aspects of Tuvaluan culture and tradition would still be perpetuated and practiced. And so there were all these questions in my head that really set me on this path to environmental law and figuring out what climate justice looked like from a Pacific perspective in the context of climate change.
Hi, your opening statement on Monday also invoked the idea of generations of time, but very different sort of type of time, the time of the sea, the time of the ocean, its creation, its delicate balance. I wondered if you could sort of begin there for me.
It is humbling to know that the first organic molecules emerged in the ocean some 3.5 billion years ago, and that it then took hundreds of millions of years for enough oxygen to build up in the ocean and atmosphere to make human life possible. And I think it's really important for us to understand that the existence of human civilization is just a small bleep in the passage